Right, so could I add my welcome to all of you for coming along this evening. I hope you have a wonderful night of reminiscences. And this panel session is to get the reminiscences off to a start. So I'll introduce the panel first of all. Lawrence Crowley, and Lawrence has got so many accomplishments. Of course, the most important is that he is a graduate of the class of 1968. He went on and qualified as a chartered accountant, was a partner in Stokes Kennedy Crowley, now KPMG. Following his, the first phase of his career, he then took on a glittering series of non-executive director roles, including Governor of the Bank of Ireland. Around the same time, I think, Lawrence, you became chairman of the Smurfit School, and that was the beginning of where we are today. That was a defining period, I think, in terms of the development of the school. I'd like to add my personal thanks to Lawrence, because Lawrence led a fundraising drive for a chair named after Michael McCormack, Professor Michael McCormack, who introduced the first MBA in the whole of Europe, which he introduced in UCD. And so the chair was called after Michael McCormack, and I am extremely lucky to hold that chair, and I'm grateful to Lawrence for his efforts to get that and many other things off the ground. The next person I'm going to introduce to you is a former colleague of mine, Professor Tony Cunningham, and Tony was a very, very accomplished teacher, and he always liked to engage his audience. Thus, he's sitting there in the front with this gimlet eye on you, and I'm warning you. So, and when Tony was my colleague, and I was a junior, and I have to be honest, clueless academic, I did not appreciate his accomplishments, which now looking back are quite exceptional. Tony went to one of the absolutely top universities in the US, Cornell, and he got himself a PhD, and that was just beyond a rare thing to do in those days. And it was just, I think, an exceptional accomplishment. And it was serendipitous, because when he came back with his PhD, Michael McCormack was starting the MBA in 1964, and Tony was a lecturer on that very first class, and for many years afterwards. So I'm looking forward to hear Tony talking about what it was like to be a lecturer in those days. And then we have Mr. Hugh Gibney, and he is from the class of 1967. And Hugh has had, I think, a wonderfully successful career in mining in Canada, North Saskatchewan, exploring for gold, in Nova Scotia and British Columbia. He worked on projects in Sierra Leone and Chile. He also brought Inco and Cominco, very big mining companies, to the Irish exploration industry. He was founding member of Oliver Prospecting, which became Dragon Oil, and he was executive chairman of IMC Exploration. So we're going to have a panel discussion on what it was like to be a student in your days in UCD, and I will be asking some questions of the panel members, but with the permission of panel members, I think it would be quite entertaining if you chipped in your insights as well to those questions. So the first question, and Lawrence, I'll ask you the first question, which is, when you think back on your days as a student in UCD, what brings a smile to your face?
Well, thank you, Niamh, very much for your very kind introduction and your generous words about whatever contribution I have been able to make. But just to say that my contribution is motivated by the fact that I believe passionately that education at all levels is the key to progress in society. And I think we, as the more better off members of Irish society need to focus our minds as to how we, with a personal contribution, can make the system work better for everybody's sake. And there were many of these things, I must say. I mean, one thing that instantly occurs to me were the series of lectures from BComm delivered at, you might recognize them now, delivered at breakneck speed by Professor Gareth Fitzgerald. You literally didn't have time to find your pencil or your pen because the lecture would be over at that stage. But what a brilliant contribution. And I suppose what I think more, when I think more about it, the enablement that the BComm, UCD, etc. gave to me was very substantial. It gave me a feeling of confidence, not overconfidence, I hope, but that I could actually now understand what these great people were thinking about and saying about. And it was a liberation, really, for me to be part of this great college.
Thank you, Lawrence. Tony, you were on the other side of the fence. So from that perspective, can you remember things that happened in the classroom that, looking back, make you smile?
Oh gosh, Niamh, there were so many things. It's difficult to focus on them. Depends on the kind of smile you were talking about. There are different kinds of smiles, you know. There are funny ones, and there are other ones which are maybe not that funny. Before I address that, could I just say I apologize for being demoted down here in case it bothers anybody. But at this stage, my poor old knees don't take kindly to steps. So I have my minder here to make sure that I don't come to too much trouble. Niamh very kindly mentioned that my honorific title at the moment is Emeritus Professor. Now, in case you didn't know, that actually is academic code for he's well past his sell-by date. But the funny thing, it's difficult to say, actually. There were so many. I'm going to just give one as a smile of satisfaction for myself, if I may. That was when Michael McCormick, God bless him, whom I had the privilege of working with for so many years, which was just fantastic experience. Michael introduced at one stage a tutorial process for first-year commerce students. And he assigned maybe 15 or whatever number was available to each full-time faculty member to meet at least once a term. And I got my allocation of 12 or 15, whatever it was at the time. And I met them on a one-to-one in the first term. And there was one girl there whom I couldn't quite engage in the discussion. She was monosyllabic in responses and really wasn't engaging in the process, which disturbed me a little bit, but I couldn't break through. And then we had the Christmas exam. And she actually was very bright. She was on a scholarship from the County Council, which is a very good one. And she came from what we might call a less than privileged background, which was great at the time. But then the exam results came out, and she got marks like 5 and 7 and 3. Now, to get marks like that, you really have to work very hard. And obviously, there was something way off the scale here. So I called her in again, and we had a chat, and the poor girl broke down into tears because I discovered she didn't want to be in college at all. That wasn't her ambition. And she was trying to break out of this terrible situation she was in. Due to family pressure, the fact that she got the scholarship, the first in her family, the first in that whole area probably, and the social pressure was enormous, and the poor girl ended up here against her wishes. So I said to her, well, if you don't want to be here, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to be a nurse. And I said, fantastic, that's marvelous. How do you plan on becoming a nurse? And she said, I've got to get out of this place. And the only way I can get out is by failing the exam. And I had to point out to her that if she failed her exam, she wouldn't get into the nursing school, because nursing schools at that stage were very, very selective. And I happened to have a sister who was a nurse tutor. So I explained to the young lady that that wasn't a good strategy to adopt for her. What she should do is, and she's well capable of it, is actually pass the exams, and then the nursing schools would be delighted to take her, because she's proven herself. So she took that on board, and she got to work, and she gave her a due. She got the exam, and I called her in then after the exam to talk to her about how she would get on, and how she could apply for the nursing school, and I'd give her a hand on that. And she said, I think I'd like to stay on for another while. So I said, great, okay, but if you stay on, you've got to engage in all of the activities in college. She was a very good camogie player, actually. So I got her to join the camogie club and so on, and join the C&E and all of these good societies. And second year, she got second honours. Third year, she got first honours. She went on and did her master's. And she's now a very successful businesswoman. That brought a smile of satisfaction to me as an academic, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah. That's a lovely anecdote, and it is lovely to work in a job where occasionally you feel actually you can make a difference, a real difference, and that's a beautiful anecdote of that type. So Hugh, what makes you smile when you think back on UCD?
There's one incident in particular I can remember, and it is related to my favourite lecturer as well. His name is John O'Connor. You may remember him, he lectured in statistics. Now, I won't mention any names, but there was a lady in my class, her father was a shirt manufacturer. There was another fellow who knew this, and before one of the lectures he wrote on the blackboard, you know, my daddy makes shirts. So John O'Connor came in and he saw this, didn't bat an eyelid. We just erased the sentence from the blackboard and carried on with the lecture. Now, but about halfway through the lecture, as we're called, he managed to incorporate this into his lecture, you know, as if it had something to do with statistics. You know, and he mentioned about Miss So-and-so's father who makes shirts. So that really is all there was to it. But it's just one particular thing that does stand out in my mind.
Right.
You know, I was in the third year at the time, you know, my final year.
Right, okay. Another nice anecdote and a nice reflection on the quality of the lecturer that was able to pick up that little theme and make something, you know, positive and nice out of it. So would anybody from the audience like to share an anecdote? Yes, thank you.
My memory of UCD, or the terrace as we call it, was coming from an all-male school. For the first time you're mixing with females. But that was a very big, important part of my education. The next most important part of my education was the social aspect of UCD, or the terrace. We opened onto Stephen's Green. There was Dwyer's Pub, there was Harto's, and there was Lamb's, later Kerwin House. The crack was mighty. And when I went there, it was 1 9/9 a pint. I had a great 3 years doing commerce. I studied hard, and I partied even harder. So my memories of Earlsford Terrace from 61 to 64 were terrific. Now I came back later to study law, to do a BCL. And what was noticeable was the change from the early 60s to the later 60s. Things had opened up. If you watched that program last night on BBC about the revolution in Paris in 1968, the student revolution. There was a total change between the late 60s and the early 60s. There were sit-ins, there were demos, there was a total new sort of attitude by the students in the later 60s compared to the earlier ones. But at all my time in UCD, it was a happy time. Some lecturers were very good, some weren't as good as others. However, we all came away with a feeling of a time well spent, and probably I would say the best years of my life.
You mentioned the female of the species.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Was it true that they weren't allowed to wear trousers in those days?
Correct. There was also a ban on wearing jeans,
I couldn't even.
applying to both sexes.
All the women one day came in trousers, and I asked somebody, what's the story? They said, it's a protest against having to wear skirts.
Right, so it wasn't just revolution in Paris in 1969, there was revolution in UCD amongst the females, so that's great. They were nice in skirts, okay.
Can I have a word, please, very quickly? Speaking as a country lad who went to one of the repressive schools down the country in the 60s, coming to UCD was the most liberating thing that ever happened to me, and I would endorse what that man said. The pubs, everything, the lectures, you can't imagine, if you think of 68 in Paris, no, Ireland wasn't like that. There were fellas coming out of the countryside who wouldn't have a clue, and it was the most liberating experience I've had in those years, so I'd just like to put that on the record.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, please, so just.
I went to the country too, and I did the same thing as those guys, right? And unfortunately, I got left to Morris Minor in the middle of the whole thing, and I failed all the exams after that.
Did you do well since?
Oh no, I did after, it's okay.
Yeah.
No, I did pass
So the environment was very distracting.
it was nice. It was comfortable.
Yeah,
Niamh,
yeah.
sorry, could I just make one point here? This is absolutely fascinating what you're saying, because you prove what I've held for a long time, that the vast bulk of learning that occurs in college occurs outside the lecture theatres. And that is critical. That is what makes college life worthwhile.
I'd like to say something that's I think he was a doctor when I first came across you. You progressed to professor. I got confused, so I had to ask my friend here. But anyway, to cut a long story short, if I had met you before I got the Morris...
So people can hear you, please.
Oh, sorry. If I had met you before I got the Morris Minor, I'd have done very well in life.
So Lawrence, you mentioned
Yeah.
you mentioned a kind of a standout lecturer that did cause a reaction amongst the audience. You mentioned Garrett Fitzgerald. Are there any other lecturers that you remember from those days?
Oh, I think there were lots.
Yeah.
There was James Meenan. There was, in his last number of years, George O'Brien, who was an absolutely incredibly interesting and focused character. And then there was a man called Franklin, teaching me statistics. I was one of his worst pupils, but I kept trying. Just as well I became an accountant afterwards. Des Halley, of course. So there's a whole raft of them,
Yeah.
including yourself, Niamh.
I didn't teach you, Lawrence. Hugh, who do you remember on the staff that brings back happy memories?
Well, John O'Connor, because he showed in the way that he handled the incident that I mentioned,
yeah.
that he had a good sense of humour.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think you could tell by him generally, from his approach in the lectures, that he was a very nice man, so to speak, and that he had this good sense of humour.
And what about the support staff? Because, there's the lecturers, and then there's some kind of characters on the support staff. Do you remember anybody?
There you are.
Paddy Keogh.
There you are. Paddy was one of the most important people in college. Absolutely. The wonderful thing about him, I don't know if you know, but he started when he was 14, and he spent all his life in college. He lived under the terrace. He had his little rooms down under the terrace, raised a family there. But the wonderful thing is that when he retired, they gave him an honorary master's.
Yeah.
And he more than deserved it.
Yeah.
And did you may say somebody else, Miss Green? Miss Green. So yeah, who was Miss Green?
Miss Power.
Sorry, Miss Power.
Miss Power was against trousers.
I have a feeling her name was Ellen Power.
Miss Power was against trousers. And you could wear trousers into the Great Hall, but not into the libraries. Do you remember? Yeah, I can remember.
Yes, the name Power is very familiar to me.
Sorry, there's somebody here down at the back.
I was saying Miss Power wouldn't leave you wear pants of any description into the libraries, but you could wear them into the Great Hall when it was a library.
Right.
So we studied in the Great Hall.
Okay, so if you wore your trousers, you studied in the reading room. Right. And how did Miss Power serve you students as a librarian? Had she a particular style?
I think. Yeah, no, my only comment on that was that I think Miss Power was one of the breed of librarians who believed that the only place for books was in the library.
And
She was very good. If you got on the right side of her, she was extremely good.
I would just like to mention that one of the chaplains, Father Vincent Keaveney, he was a very nice man and very helpful to anyone who had a difficulty.
Right.
Father Vincent Keaveney.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And somebody said earlier about, well, Tony is talking about, the education wasn't just in the classroom, and somebody else was talking about engaging in all the activities in the college. So what activities were there in those days? What did you like to do, Lawrence?
Well, as little as possible, probably.
Well, that's the library, possibly, but I'm sure there were other things that you liked doing.
Yeah, there were very progressive sports bodies,
Yeah.
which one could join in and change and enhance the skill levels. And the president of UCD, as I recall it, Dr. Michael Tierney, had a very strong view about one particular sport, which was sailing on the water, of which he strongly disapproved and refused to give any grant of any kind to the sailing club.
Right.
Whereas other sports didn't seem to arise his ire to the same extent as sailing did.
Right.
But there were lots of things you could do. I remember joining a chess club. I didn't last very long because on an intellectual basis I got thrown out fairly quickly. But it was an interesting experience. There was a whole opening of one's mind in my experience of UCD.
The LNH was very important.
Very important. Yeah. Yeah.
Cosgrave, there were a pile of
Yeah.
extroverts on Saturday night. You had to go to the LNH.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
And then off to the Olympic ball.
That's right. Peter Walker.
I think we have an even bigger set of challenges arising now with the advent of longer life, healthier life, and there are you planning your parents doing it for you, planning that you have an education in one's case up to 14, if you're lucky up to 21 or 18, and if you're extremely lucky, to the university system. But that's changing, because what's now happening is that life is extending, quite seriously extending. And this is going to place huge problems on pension funds, because people are going to live, they say a girl born today has a natural life expectancy in Ireland of 100 years.
What about cancer?
What about?
Cancer.
Yeah.
Lawrence, there's two things that, sorry,
I'm
Niamh, can
happy.
I interrupt there for a
Sorry.
second?
Sorry.
Two anecdotes that Lawrence mentioned, the sports bodies that were there at the time, and somebody mentioned Dr. Gareth Fitzgerald. Two things about Gareth that I remember. One was that in our final year, if I'm correct, we were told a week before the exam that the course that we'd done with Gareth wouldn't be on the paper because he had given a different lecture series to the night students than he had to the day students, which was great news for everybody. But on the sports side, and talking about the chaplains as well, there was a chaplain, Father Sweeney, and the UCD football club, Gaelic football club's dinner dance. All the sports clubs had black tie dinner dancers at the time. Ours was in the Gresham, and to think of in the 1960, it must probably 65 or 66, Father Sweeney lent me his Volkswagen Beetle so that I could drive 5 or 6 fellas who wouldn't be able to drive anywhere around, and I had his Volkswagen Beetle for the evening and into about 6 o'clock the following morning. So
Gosh.
that happened in 1965 or 66, I think.
Yeah, that was very decent, yeah. So here and here. Just tell.
Yeah, one of the things not mentioned, talking about Gareth Fitzgerald, those of us who had him for lectures, and he did lecture on what was called national economics. And the one thing about national economics that differed from everything else was there were no textbooks for national economics. You depended entirely on his lecture. Gareth came in, head down, stood at the top of the class, took off at 100 miles an hour, never communicated with anybody, and then when he was finished his lecture, he just departed out the door. So leaving everybody totally mesmerized. I was very lucky insofar as I had done a shorthand course, and I was able to take notes, and my notes were invaluable, and I made more friends through distributing notes than anything else. But one of the things that would have amazed us, and none of us would have thought of at the time, was that Gareth would ever go into politics. Because Gareth was regarded as almost a hermit type, and definitely never communicated with anybody. So when he went into politics, it was a total surprise. Talking about politics, and that would be of interest to you, of course, politics in college were very, very important. The SRC elections were enormous in their importance, and anyone who was here in college between 61 and 66 would remember the battles between Jerry Collins, the machine, as the Fianna Fáil operation was known, and they controlled the SRC and controlled it like the mafia in many ways. And many people here will remember, I don't know what year it was, 62, 63, 64, when the main candidates for the SRC in the SRC were Jerry Collins' nominee, who I think was Ronnie, can you remember? He was from Limerick anyway, and Vincent Brown. So Vincent Brown and Jerry Collins were the main proponents at that particular time. And of course, Paddy Keogh was the life of Irisford Terrace at that particular time. And I remember well, when a lecturer wouldn't turn up, very often Paddy Keogh came into the lecture hall and proceeded to almost give a lecture, and he was marvellous, and he well deserved. He really shouldn't have got a master's, Tony. He should have got a doctorate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you for that. And then,
Yes, one of the interesting points that comes out is a reference to the speaker before, who mentioned about the Garrett's exam having to be recalibrated because of the night students. And of course, there was a whole functioning, I was a night student, so there was a whole functioning commerce class operating in parallel at night. And there were the odd clashes with what was happening in the daytime. And I think Garrett's might have been one, but John O'Connor of happy memory was another, because he was teaching us statistics, I think, and at a certain point in the year, looking at the exam, we suddenly said, wait a minute, we don't know any of this. Who's been teaching us this stuff? We were doing something else. But anyway, we all passed that year for some reason. But there was a parallel life at night. So we were coming in when everybody else was relaxed and going home. And yes, the facilities, you know, we were there, we went in, we went to lectures, heads down, went to work, all that sort of stuff. We missed some of the ferment. And I suppose talking to people smoking out the back, I think it's the backs, or the people used to smoke out around the back. I remember Tony Cunningham and Michael McCormick, because they were introducing us to new stuff. You know, it wasn't being done. And Garrett, always a tour de force, because sometimes Garrett was used as a kind of the relief, the sub at night. So he came in one October in second year. He delivered a lecture in October to a group, to us, and sometime in March he was scheduled and he came back in and he gave us exactly the same lecture, word for word, and it was, you know, brilliant in that sense. So the memories are different, and sometimes I envy the others, and then I realised there was another training as well, going at night, because it was an opportunity that we couldn't have got anywhere else at the time. And for that, I suppose UCD had to be really congratulated, because we were opening up potential.
I have a slightly different memory of Garrett in that he did communicate. I'm a bit of a fraud here because I was a Group 9 economics, and he used to take groups of us down to the country shop, a group of about 10, have coffee and have discussions with us. So more or less tutorials for us. So, but I am surprised that he went into politics, because I do remember him ranting about the cost of ministerial cars.
Right, yeah.
Just a couple of things. First, about Garrett. Yeah, everybody's right. He raced through the lectures. But my memory is, after the lecture, if you wanted to go and talk to him, he'd talk to you for as long as you wanted to do that. He was fantastic in that way.
Yeah.
And he had an ability, you know, at that time in teaching of any kind, there was a huge gap between student and teacher. Garrett never, ever conveyed that gap. He had that extraordinary ability. Neither did Tony, and you're still looking well on it. And one other person that I remember, I think it might have been the Emmy Conyer, was Frank Moran. I mean, talk about opening up your mind to stuff. He was fresh from the Wharton School in wherever that is, Pennsylvania, I suppose, or somewhere. But yes, and I was a night student like that other man. I don't know how many of them are here tonight. We were the guys who didn't have the luxury of studying, you know, all day, or we still had to go to the pub though. But I think most of us, at least I was working in one of the banks at the time, which, like all banks, were hugely overstaffed, so it meant that I wasn't under too much pressure. But wonderful experience, opened up the mind. Michael McCormick, Tony, Frank Moran, Garrett, and Mr. The man on the statistics that used to keep putting the chalk to the far side of his hand until he thought he'd fall off the dais, Franklin. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Hugh, can I go back to you? And what activities did you get up to when you were in UCD? Were you a member of any of the clubs?
Not very much, actually, I have to say. I wasn't a great socializer. But certain things I do remember all right, attending a few sessions in a few of the debates in the LNH, for instance.
Yeah.
Very interesting. There was also, was it Kerwin's pub at the bottom of Leeson Street? It was just around the corner from Ernsford Terrace. I used to go there occasionally.
And Tony, you were a colleague of the lecturers that have been spoken of, and from that perspective, do you have any memories?
Well, just talking about Garrett, the thing that I remember about Garrett was I got him, he had an office down the corridor from me, and I got word that he wanted to see me. So I went off down to see him, and he was in his office. He was typing away. He was typing up his article for the Irish Times, I'm pretty sure. And he had a question for me about something to do with the article. And we discussed it. But all the time we were discussing it, he was typing. And he was typing something, not what we were discussing, but something else. Now, that's an ability which I have found very rare, I must say.
Certain weaknesses, he had no interest in horses whatsoever. There were the two areas I know he would not. He'd never in a pub.
But he was very good in transport.
Immigrants and remittance.
Well, that was it. About the timetable for the airlines all over Europe.
That's right.
An expert on making connections. And he spoke about this himself. Another area that we haven't mentioned is that at that time there was a very, very strong dram soccer. And a lot of people made, sort of quite interesting careers afterwards, both in theatre management as well as being directors and performers. And it's quite a lot of reasonably well-known names.
The Cusick sisters, Neve Cusick, they were all there then.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And Des Keogh is on in Beauty's Theatre in Grafton Street at 1 o'clock tomorrow, if anyone's interested.
Right. And was Des Keogh in UCD in those days?
Yes.
Right, yeah. Dermot, you wanted to say something.
Well, just to say, I mean, we all admire those who actually studied at night and got their BComm degree. But I can assure you, Pat, or give you some comfort in assuring you, while I was a full-time student, I didn't indulge in the luxury of studying all day. But one person that struck me particularly, and particularly was important for me in my life, was Des Halley. I hadn't studied accountancy at school, and so my first experience learning accountancy was from Des Halley. I thought he was a really excellent lecturer, and a great enthusiasm. And I say to people, I used to be an accountant, but I'm all right now. But I think in fact it was Des's enthusiasm in accountancy that certainly fired me to spend a lot of my life teaching accountants.
Yeah.
Just one last point I'd make if I could, and that is that I also have memory of history teachers, Des Williams, Dudley Edwards. And the reason I remember them was because at the time that we joined UCD, I think there was a feeling that saving your presence, Tony, that in fact that business wasn't quite a subject of the arts, and that we needed therefore to study an arts.
That was very pronounced, don't worry.
And we needed to be exposed to the arts. I certainly always felt a certain envy of students who'd studied philosophy or history or politics. I always felt that perhaps they were educated while we were trained. It took me a long time to discover that in actual fact you can develop judgmental, analytical, in a whole range of skills to any discipline. But the history teachers I remember, because we were compelled to study one art subject. I chose history. As a result, all my leisure reading now is history. And I think it may be something that I know that you have the option at present, and the students have the option to do.
I did also, and Dudley Edwards was an act to see. It was incredible. I don't think there are lectures like Dudley Edwards anymore. Wild hair, flying everywhere, wild presentation. It was just tremendous stuff. We were all very lucky to have people like that.
Neve, I was coming from the arts side of things in the sense that I did economics, not commerce. And in the first year, we had a very broad introductory year. And I remember outstanding people like Dr. Roger McHugh, who talked about the new man's concept of the university. And talking about opening of minds, which has been mentioned here as a kind of a theme, he was very much in that line, as also was John O'Mara on the classics, the whole Greek and Roman civilization. Really opened it up to us a whole extra dimension. And then on the economic front, we had Paddy Lynch, who was chairman of Aer Lingus, and very stimulating lecturer who introduced us to Keynes and other concepts really broadening our mind again. And then, probably not very well known, but later Auxiliary Bishop Kavanagh, who talked to us about politics, and he had a Socratic method of putting out propositions. It was more like a tutorial than a lecture, but again, he was trying to force us to think, which was really very valuable. And then finally, on the student front, Ellen H. has been mentioned. Paddy Cosgrave and Tony Clare were at their peak, and I think they won the University for Britain and Ireland, the whole competition, and went on to have very illustrious careers, shorter careers than they should have been. But they were an extra dimension to our lives, I think. So they're some of the recollections I have.
Right, very good, thank you. And gentleman at the back, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
There was a small anecdote concerning Paddy Keogh and Dudley Edwards. In 1966, it was the 50 years anniversary of the 16 Rising. And as you went in Terrace for Terrace, there was a statue of Wolfe Tone right in the centre. And one day Paddy Keogh came in and he looked at the statue and he said, "What the hell is Dudley Edwards doing here?" I switched the statues and Dudley Edwards was in the main hall and nobody had noticed it for weeks.
Very good, thank you for that. So just to our panellists, Lawrence, is there one last observation or comment you'd like to share with us?
No, I don't think so. I think the university system is alive and well, and judging by the reaction of the people here, there's great interest in it and recognition of its importance.
Right, thank you. And thank you again, Lawrence, for all you've done for us. I don't think we would be as advanced as we are without your leadership, so thank you.
Here, here.
Hugh, is there any last comments that you would like to make?
Well, yes, so just relation to Miss Power and Paddy Keogh, because my mother took a BA in UCD in the 1920s. I think she, I'm not certain of this, but I think she graduated in 1927. And I think that Miss Power was a classmate of hers because she knew her, although they didn't actually say mix or associate with each other. And as well as that, of course, my mother also remembered us Paddy Keogh because he was the porter at the time in the mid-1920s, so it was a coincidence that he was still the porter 40 years later when I was there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hugh. And Tony, any last insight from yourself?
Well, if I could just make a personal observation, it's been a real privilege to be in the position I was in. I was very, very fortunate. And we've had absolutely fantastic students coming through who've gone on and done marvelous things, wonderful things. But personally, one of the best satisfaction I got was shortly before I retired. I was having coffee with a bunch of graduate students in the restaurant, and they knew I was retiring, so they were, open up, and they informed me that I was known among them as the prof. Now, that really got home to me and gave me unbelievable satisfaction. Now, you may not think there's much in that. I mean, the prof, I was supposed to be one. What the hell, there's that. But in learning what they called me, I also learned what they called some of the other professors.
Right, that's a nice note to... okay.
There was a famous cartoonist in Dublin in the early 60s, and it was of Michael Hillary, then Minister for Education, later our President, presenting Michael Tierney with a shoehorn that he might be able to get a few more students into Earlsford Terrace by squeezing them in. When I think of the days in Earlsford Terrace, an overcrowded slum, but a fantastic place, and then I come out here and I say, we have gone forward by leaps and bounds.
Thank you, thank you. This is just the beginning of the reminiscences for this evening. And so I'd like to draw this part of the evening to a close by thanking Lawrence, Hugh and Tony, and also thanking you for being so participative and sharing your stories. And so we're now moving upstairs for a meal, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
No, I just want to make a short statement here about a lecturer who did commerce in UCD in 1968. He was a man who lived in the northern side of Dublin, and he was a teacher in some school in Dublin. He was one of the economics teachers, and he retired and he moved to Barryrow in West Cork. I've forgotten his name, but he began in 1967-8 as a teacher in UCD, and he retired to Barry, and he died about a year ago, and I've forgotten his name. He lived in Barryrow. Bill O'Riordan, is that his name?
That's right.
And he was a very nice man,
That's
so
correct, yeah.
I'm glad I heard the name. Bill O'Riordan. Yeah. So that's okay, and he was a good man, a good lecturer, and a very likeable person.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Just one last anecdote.
We were asked about what made us smile when we were in UCD. My biggest smile was when UCD beat UCC in Camogie, in Queens and Belfast.
Thank you. Marvellous. So, thank you all very much.